Have you ever wondered why some stories get erased so completely that even the people who live through them stop telling their children? There are events in our past that do not make it into any record, not because no one bothered to write them down, but because the people responsible for writing them down decided, deliberately, that they should not exist, that the truth was too disturbing to preserve, that the community that had failed to see it in time would be better served by forgetting entirely. This is one of those stories. Before we go any further, drop in the comments where you are watching from. Tell me the state or the city. Because what I am about to tell you happened inside a schoolroom, in a place where children were supposed to be safe, and I want to know where you are before you hear it. This is the story of Vesta Calloway. School teacher, caretaker, the woman trusted with the education and safekeeping of the youngest members of her community. And one of the most disturbing figures to emerge from the history of the Kentucky mountains. Breathitt County, Kentucky, in 1906, was already a place with a difficult reputation. It was known across the region as a county where feuds went long and blood went cheap, where the law was a negotiation rather than a certainty, and where an outsider who did not know the right names was wise to move carefully. The mountains around it were old and dense, the hollows between them deep enough that sunlight hit the creek beds only at midday, and sometimes not even then. Families lived on ridges that had carried the same surnames for 4 and 5 generations. The roads were poor, the winters were long, and the nearest authority of any consequence, a real courthouse, a real jail, a real response from any institution that could address a serious crime, was the better part of a day's hard riding from the farthest hollows. In that context, the schoolteacher was not a minor figure. She was one of the few people in any hollow community who represented something larger than the hollow itself. She had been elsewhere. She had been educated. She was, in the precise sense of the word, a connection between the children of these mountains and whatever kind of future existed outside them. The parents who sent their children to her were not merely seeking literacy. They were placing their children in the hands of someone who was supposed to know better than they did. That placement required trust. And trust, in Breathitt County in 1906, was not given carelessly. Vesta Calloway was 37 years old when she arrived at the Canoe Creek School in the autumn of 1904. She had previously taught at a school in Letcher County for 2 years, and before that had received her teacher's certification from a normal school in Frankfort. She was a lean woman, not tall, but straight-spined in a way that made her appear taller than she was. Her hair was dark brown, and kept pulled back so tightly at every observed occasion that the skin at her temples appeared to strain. Her eyes were a deep, still green, the color of creek water in shadow, and they had a quality that parents later struggled to describe in their testimonies. Not warmth, not coldness, but something between the two that made a person feel simultaneously seen and measured. She dressed in dark gray and dark brown. She was never seen to smile without a reason. For the first year, nothing unusual was reported. She taught the children their letters and their numbers. She assigned them readings from the Bible and from a McGuffey reader that had seen better decades. She kept discipline with a firm hand, which no parent objected to, and she corresponded regularly with the county school superintendent, whose records show routine and unremarkable reports from her classroom through the spring of 1905. She took meals most evenings alone and was known in the community as a private woman who discouraged social calls. Nobody thought too much of it. Private women were not uncommon. What was uncommon, most people would later say, was how much she seemed to know about each child's home situation. What was uncommon was how carefully she chose which children to keep after school hours, always for extra instruction, always with a reason that made complete sense. The first sign that something was wrong came in the autumn of 1905, during the second year of Calloway's tenure at Canoe Creek. A girl named Ruthie Sizemore, 11 years old, and described by her mother as clever and cheerful, began arriving home from school quiet and withdrawn. Her appetite dropped. She stopped playing with the younger children in the evenings. Her mother, Loretta Sizemore, mentioned this to two neighbors and then, after a week during which Ruthie barely spoke at dinner and wept once without explanation, went to the schoolhouse to speak with Vesta Calloway directly. According to a statement Loretta Sizemore gave to the Breathitt County Sheriff in March of 1906, a statement recorded in a ledger now held in the Kentucky State Archives in Frankfort, Calloway received her calmly, listened to her concerns, and explained that Ruthie had been having some difficulties with her lessons, and that the frustration was likely the source of the behavioral change. She suggested Ruthie stay after school 3 afternoons a week for additional instruction. Loretta agreed. Ruthie's condition worsened, and she was not the only one. Over the following 3 months, 4 other children at the Canoe Creek School showed similar patterns. Each one was a child who had been selected by Calloway for after-school instruction. Each one became progressively withdrawn, anxious, and reluctant to attend school. One boy, James Combs, aged 9, began wetting the bed, which he had not done since he was 4. His parents were told by Calloway that he was struggling emotionally due to the recent death of an uncle, and that extra kindness at home was what he needed. A second girl, Ada Pigman, aged 12, told her mother in late January of 1906 that she did not want to go back to school. When her mother pressed her for a reason, Ada said that she did not know how to say it, and then said nothing more. None of the parents initially connected their children's experiences to one another. Each family was given a private and individually tailored explanation by Calloway. Each explanation was plausible. Each family accepted it because Calloway was the teacher, because she had been educated at a school in Frankfort, and because there was no framework yet for what they were collectively experiencing. The connection was made by a man named Dorsey Fitch, who ran the supply store at the crossroads and who had no children at the school, but who had a habit of paying careful attention to the people who came through his door. Over the course of 3 months, he had heard Loretta Sizemore, and then the Combs family, and then 2 other families mention their children's changes, each one attributing it to school stress, to adjustment, to the hard season. Fitch began asking questions, not official questions, store questions, the kind that get answered honestly because the person being asked doesn't realize they're being interviewed. In February of 1906, he brought what he had gathered to County Sheriff Harlan Webb. Webb was 51 years old, experienced and methodical, a man who had been sheriff through enough of Breathitt County's violent history that he had learned to distinguish the dramatic from the genuinely dangerous. What Fitch presented him was not dramatic. 5 children, all from the same school, all showing behavioral deterioration, all spending after-school hours alone with the same woman. Webb agreed it needed a closer look. He visited the Canoe Creek School on a Tuesday morning, unannounced. Calloway received him without apparent concern. She showed him the classroom, answered his questions about each of the 5 children with the same calm, individualized explanations she had given their parents, and accompanied him to the door with a composed pleasantness that Webb found, he later wrote in his personal case notes, faintly unsettling in a way he could not immediately specify. His official report from that visit recorded nothing actionable. His personal case notes, discovered among his effects after his retirement in 1921 and preserved by his family, included one line that did not appear in the official record. The back storage room off the classroom was padlocked from the outside, and when he asked about it, Calloway had changed the subject so smoothly He had not realized it until he was already on his horse. Webb returned 2 weeks later with 2 deputies and a warrant. The storage room contained a lockbox. Inside the lockbox were 7 notebooks, each one labeled with a child's name in Calloway's precise handwriting. They were not gradebooks. They were not lesson records. They were detailed behavioral logs, observations of each child's responses to specific stimuli, responses to isolation, responses to various forms of psychological pressure applied methodically over weeks. The notebooks read like the records of an experiment. Each child had been assessed for compliance and for what Calloway had labeled in her own hand as susceptibility to instruction beyond formal curriculum. There was also a correspondence, letters to and from an unnamed party in Louisville, discussing the placement of children in domestic service positions with families who did not ask too many questions about the children's origins. 3 children had already been placed. They were found over the following 6 weeks through contact with Louisville authorities. All 3 were recovered. All 3 had been told that their families had agreed to the arrangement, that they were being given opportunities their hollow could not provide. All 3 were between the ages of 9 and 13. Vesta Calloway was arrested on March 19, 1906. At her trial in the fall of that year, the courtroom was filled beyond capacity every day of testimony. She sat through the proceedings with the same straight-spined composure that parents had described from the schoolroom. Still, contained, occasionally consulting a small notebook she had been permitted to keep. She was convicted of child trafficking and sentenced to 20 years at the Kentucky Reformatory. The records of her release or death after 1926 are incomplete. Whether she served the full sentence, was released early, or died in custody has not been established in any document currently accessible. Today, the building that served as the Canoe Creek School was torn down in 1938. A farm road runs across the site. Nothing marks it. The county historical record from that period contains no mention of Calloway or of the children. The families involved were not asked to contribute their accounts to the historical record. The official Breathitt County history published in 1952 describes the years between 1900 and 1910 as a period of educational development and community building. 3 children were taken from their homes and told their families had given them away. That detail does not appear in the 1952 history either. Webb moved more deliberately now. He brought in a deputy from another county, a man with no personal history in Breathitt and no existing relationships to protect, to conduct a second round of interviews with the parents of all 5 children. Those interviews were conducted in the first 2 weeks of March 1906, and they produced something the initial interviews had not produced. Because the interviewer was outside the community web, and because enough time had passed that the parents were less invested in the explanations Calloway had given them, and more invested in what they were actually seeing in their children. 3 of the 5 parents, in the second round of interviews, disclosed something they had not disclosed the first time. Their children had told them. In the weeks immediately following the most intensive period of after-school sessions, that they were afraid of the storage room. Not of anything they had seen in the storage room. Of the storage room itself. Of being told to wait outside it while Calloway went inside alone and sometimes stayed inside for long periods that the children could not account for. 2 of the children had used the same word to describe the waiting. The word was watching. They felt, they told their parents, as though something in the room was watching them while they stood outside it. Webb found that consistent across accounts that had been gathered independently, and found it significant. He applied for the warrant. The lockbox that was recovered from the storage room was taken to the county seat under seal. Its contents were reviewed by Webb, the Breathitt County Circuit Court clerk. and a representative of the State Board of Education who had been notified of the investigation. The review took most of a day. When they emerged from the room where the review had been conducted, the clerk, who had worked in county government for 23 years and had handled documentation from several of Breathitt County's most notorious cases, said only that the contents were unlike anything he had encountered in 2 decades of records work, and that he needed an hour before he could continue his regular duties. What the notebooks represented, in the assessment of a specialist in child welfare law who reviewed them for the prosecution, was a systematic evaluation of children's vulnerability to adult control, their family situations, their individual insecurities, their capacity for secrecy, their likelihood of disclosure. Callaway had been assessing each child the way a buyer assesses livestock, not out of cruelty in any passionate sense, out of cold calculation. The notebooks were, the specialist testified, the most methodical documentation of predatory assessment of children she had encountered in 15 years of child welfare work. The correspondence with the Louisville party, a man who was eventually identified as a labor broker with connections to several households in Louisville and Lexington that employed child labor in domestic arrangements that did not involve the consent of the children's families, established the commercial dimension of what Callaway had been operating. She was not acting from any single motive. She was acting from a combination of financial incentive and something the prosecution's specialist described as a fundamental indifference to the personhood of the children in her care, an indifference so complete that it had never, in the 18 months she had been at Canoe Creek, produced a moment of hesitation visible in any document or account. The 3 recovered children were brought home in April and May of 1906. Their returns were not public events. The families received them quietly, without gathering, without the community ceremony that typically attended significant events in Hollow life. 2 of the 3 children were able to return to something approximating their previous lives over the course of the following year, according to the accounts of their parents in follow-up interviews conducted by county authorities. The 3rd child, a girl named Ada Pigman, was 12 years old when she was recovered and required what her mother described in a 1907 letter to the county school board. A letter requesting that Ada not be required to return to formal schooling at the Canoe Creek location, as a longer period of quiet before she was ready to be in a room with adults she did not already trust. Whether Ada Pigman eventually recovered fully is not established in any surviving record. The community of Canoe Creek had to rebuild its school. A new teacher was hired in the fall of 1906. Attendance that first year was lower than it had been before Callaway's tenure, and lower again the year after. The trust that a schoolroom requires, the compact between a community and a person entrusted with its children's hours and attention, had been broken in a way that did not mend quickly. The Breathitt County School Board placed a formal notation in its administrative record following the Callaway case, requiring that any school teacher with unsupervised access to students after regular school hours obtain written permission from the supervising trustee for each such session. The notation was the first formal procedural change in the board's operating history that was specifically motivated by a child safety incident. It was not widely publicized. The board minutes from that period are available at the Breathitt County Clerk's office in Jackson, Kentucky. The relevant entry is dated October 9, 1906. It is 3 sentences long. It does not mention Callaway by name. There is a question at the center of this case that every parent who hears it will understand immediately. Vesta Callaway operated inside an institution specifically designed to protect children. She operated there for more than a year before anyone put the pattern together. The individual warning signs were real. Each family saw them. Each family reported them to the person responsible for the children's safety. And that person used those reports to make the targeting more precise. What does this tell us about the way we extend trust to institutions? And what do we owe each other in those moments when a child tells us, in whatever language a child can manage, that something is wrong? What happened at Canoe Creek is one of the most disturbing things I have found in the records of this region. Not because it was violent, but because it was patient. Because it used the appearance of education as a mask for something that education is the precise opposite of. If you believe that Vesta Calloway was a rare aberration, one broken person in a system that otherwise functioned, leave that below. If you believe she is evidence of something more systemic, something worth examining in how we place trust in institutions, comment that. Subscribe if these stories matter to you. The mountains have more to give. Until next time, watch who watches your children.